Here to present Sell Dreams, Not Products, please give a warm welcome to best-selling author and communication expert, Carmine Gallo.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I enjoyed watching some of the presentations yesterday and getting to meet so many of you. One thing is clear, and this is what I have to say at the outset because I'm reminded of it, especially watching the presentations this morning. I am not here to tell you how to do your jobs. I am here to elevate the jobs you do with proven, specific, practical communication strategies that will make you far more persuasive. You know insurance. You know premium financing for insurance. I am obsessed with communication in all of its forms. And how do we communicate the very complex information that we have to make an emotional connection with customers, with our clients in different fields? What I love about this group especially, and the reason why I asked Julian, can I sit in on some of the presentations yesterday, is because I know some of you already, this is a growth mindset group. You're always learning, always growing. Like Satya Nadella at Microsoft once said, you are learn-it-alls and not know-it-alls. Always better to be a learn-it-all. Like former PepsiCo CEO Indra Nooyi, who once said that you cannot overinvest in communication skills. That's a growth mindset. Now, I know that we've talked about communication yesterday. Deborah did a wonderful job. You heard some communication tactics from Julian, from Michael. You're going to hear a little bit more about it today because we cannot overinvest in the skill. What's the number that we're going to put on it, though? I saw Michael present a lot of numbers and data points today, so I know you like data. What's the number, the ROI, the return on investment that you're going to get from spending your time with me this morning? Let's say it's 50%. Warren Buffett once said that if you can sharpen your skills of public speaking, it'll boost your value by 50%. Why? Because of our tagline. Great ideas happen here. Well, if great ideas happen here, Warren Buffett said you can have the greatest idea in the world, but if you cannot persuade another person to take action on those ideas, you won't be nearly as successful. How are we going to overcome the objections? You folks are a lot closer to this than I am, but I've seen the surveys. These are just some of the many objections that come up. Interest rates might rise. I don't want to tie up collateral. Oh, and this one, it seems complicated. That's why Michael yesterday was talking about making it easy to understand. How do you do that? How do you do that on a Zoom meeting? How do you do that on a PowerPoint with a PowerPoint slide? There are very specific tactics that I'll teach you this morning. But there's one tactic I cannot teach you, and that's passion. I can show you tools and techniques. I cannot teach passion, which I think is the underpinning, really, for everything we're going to talk about today. You're passionate about what you do, so we'll talk about how to transmit that passion to another person. But if you think about the high net worth clients, I especially remember this from Julian yesterday. What are they passionate about? It's not the obvious. It's not always about money. It's about community, preserving a legacy, maintaining their philanthropic goals. We need to help them understand that we understand that that's what they're passionate about. Good communicators, and I've studied this for decades, I've written 10 books on it, I teach at Harvard at the graduate school. I have found through my own experience and through my research, great communicators are audience-centric. They think about the audience first. It's not about their tools, their policies, their information. It's what their tools, their products can do for the audience. And no one was better at being an audience-first communicator than Steve Jobs. I wrote one of the first books on how Steve Jobs delivered his awe-inspiring presentations. And whether you're on a stage or you're just having a one-on-one conversation, you can learn a lot about how Steve Jobs framed the message and how he designed the words and the message that he would use to convince customers. In 1997, Steve Jobs returned to Apple after a 12-year absence. Some of you know the history. In that time, he gave an informal staff meeting. A video from that staff meeting emerged on YouTube not too long ago. I want to show you just a few seconds from that video. Listen carefully to how a masterful communicator reframes the product. Not so much about the product, but what the product means for the lives of his customers.
To me, marketing's about values. This is a very complicated world. It's a very noisy world. And we're not going to get a chance to get people to remember much about us. No company is. And so we have to be really clear on what we want them to know about us. The way to do that is not to talk about speeds and feeds. It's not to talk about MIPS and megahertz. It's not to talk about why we're better than Windows. Our customers want to know who is Apple and what is it that we stand for. Where do we fit in this world? And what we're about isn't making boxes for people to get their jobs done, although we do that well. We do that better than almost anybody in some cases. But Apple's about something more than that. Apple, at the core, its core value, is that we believe that people with passion can change the world for the better. That's what we believe.
First, I love that quote. One of my favorite quotes. People with passion can change the world for the better. But did you hear the questions he's asking? He's asking the questions and answering them for his team. What is it that we want people to believe about us? What are our core values? What do they want them to know about us? We need to ask the same things before your next meeting. What do I want my client to know about me? What are my values? The tactics we're going to learn is how to transfer those values to another person. We have proven rhetorical tools that we can use. But you got to start with the right questions. Who are we? What are we really selling? What do I want the clients to know about us and our values? Jargon has a purpose. It's not inherently bad because that's the language that we use with each other. You're communicating with each other in shorthand. That's fine. But audience-centric communicators think about the audience first and act as translators, taking that information and translating it into a package that ultimately moves people to action. Here's the best part. We know how to do this. Aristotle gave us the building blocks of persuasion 2,300 years ago. He said all great speakers, specifically speakers, they didn't have presenters and PowerPoint back then. He said all great speakers who are ultimately persuasive have three things. You may have seen these before. Ethos, logos, pathos. Ethos is character, credibility. In our world, I think ethos is what precedes us, the word of mouth. What have people heard about you? Your reputation. I heard the word integrity from Julian so many times. Ethos. Without ethos, it's going to be hard to persuade people of anything. I'm going to assume we have ethos. Check. Logos is what you specialize in. That's what I saw this morning. The data, the numbers, the financials. And pathos is emotion, connecting people emotionally. You cannot persuade without pathos. Now, here's the remarkable thing if you study the history of communication and persuasion. The tools of communication have changed. Aristotle, Abraham Lincoln, they didn't have streaming, Zoom, WebEx, PowerPoint, but they used the very same tactics that great communicators use today. The tools have changed. The human brain is not. which is why I've really dived into the cognitive science of persuasion over the last many years. Because if you understand how the brain processes the information, you'll be far more effective. Doris Kearns Goodwin has written many books on Abraham Lincoln. Take a look at one of the excerpts from her book on Lincoln. Lincoln drew crowds from the countryside, eager to be regaled and entertained by a master storyteller. He understood early on that concrete examples and stories provided the best vehicles for teaching. We're still doing that. Yesterday, when I was listening to Michael, he was talking about the Iowa farm family. He was using an example from Yellowstone, the Dutton Ranch. My wife and I have just completed all the seasons of Yellowstone. It resonated with me. But what was he doing? He was using a concrete example and a story because he knows that provides the best vehicle for teaching. It hasn't changed. Hasn't changed in 300,000 years. This is John Medina. John Medina is one of my mentors. He is a molecular scientist at the University of Washington, has been studying cognitive science and the brain for 40 years. And as someone I've learned a lot from, he said, Carmine, when you speak to an audience, if this is all they remember, leave them with this. The brain does not pay attention to boring things. So you may think you have the greatest ideas. You may believe that in all of your research, the information, the data proves your point, but we all know you have to be effective. Not just right, you have to be effective. And if you're boring, you'll put people to sleep. They'll drown out and they will move on to other things. You will not be nearly as persuasive as you could be. So I want you to watch a short excerpt from an interview that I conducted not too long ago with John Medina. Listen for two things. One, what does he mean by the brain doesn't pay attention to boring things? And two, my natural question as a communication coach, what does it pay attention to? And that'll set the foundation for the rest of the discussion.
The brain doesn't pay attention to boring things. If it thinks it's bored with something, it'll go to something else. It has a lot of stuff to do. So where that touches on the brain sciences is this. There is a concept called an emotionally competent stimulus, an ECS. These are stimuli that can evoke an emotion, and we pay attention to that like a son of a gun. Emotions appear to have many functions, but one of the biggest, depending on how you define it, is that it acts like Post-it notes. Emotions are actually Post-it notes that you will tag to certain stimuli for further processing later. Emotionally competent stimuli are immediate Post-it notes that say, brain, you need to pay attention to this. You may not be able to get the details, but man, you need to lock down on that for a second. On the basis of that, there are lots of things you can say about how to make things less boring by simply understanding the power and the role emotionally competent stimuli play in a lecture or in a boardroom or simply in a conversation between two people. The brain absolutely loves narrative information for reasons we're not sure we fully understand. We know that it is an extraordinarily efficient way of delivering information. The fundamentals are absolutely the same and they don't vary. They haven't varied in 350,000 years.
The reason why John Medina brought up 350,000 years is because when I was interviewing, there was a lot of articles out there about TikTok saying, oh, TikTok is rewiring our brain. And John said, no, rest easy, Carmine. It's only been around 6 years. Our brains have evolved for 350,000 years. It hasn't had enough time to rewire the brain yet. But the point is that if we understand how your clients receive the information that you're delivering, you'll be far more effective. This is now the second time in this conference that you've heard the word narrative. First heard it from Deborah yesterday. Then I heard it again this morning. Narrative, what is that? I'll give you some very practical tools to create your own narratives. But just based on the science, one last time for a few minutes, I've talked to anthropologists, and they're really interesting. An anthropologist said that, yeah, this is how our brains evolved. As Deborah mentioned yesterday, we're wired for story, but it all started when our cave-dwelling ancestors gained control of fire. And it makes sense. With fire, we could cook food, bigger brains, ward off predators. But here's what's fascinating to me in communication, is that once our ancestors gained control of fire, they started having campfires. And they sat around the campfire, and what did they do? They exchanged information in a way that educated the rest of the tribe and inspired people to take action. Isn't that what we're still trying to do in every meeting? Inform, we have information you don't know. Educate, here's how it works. And we'd like to inspire you to take action. It hasn't changed. We're just using different tools. This is a famous campfire pit on an island owned by an ultra high net worth individual. Who owns Necker Island? Do you know? Richard Branson, of course. I've interviewed Richard Branson several times, and he loves the concept of storytelling. In fact, he says, I have been fascinated by the intersection of storytelling and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs who make a difference are, in effect, professional storytellers. Guy Kawasaki, who was mentored by Steve Jobs, he was Apple's first evangelist, said, stories are 10 times more powerful than adjectives. The great speakers, the great presenters are storytellers. I know we have a lot of adjectives. I've heard them. We're capital efficient, liquidity preserving. Today I heard cash value options. Okay, fine. That's our language. That's the language we speak. But that's not ultimately how to build trust with a client and how to move them to action. We need to take a deeper dive into what this means when we say narrative. There's two types of stories that most good business communicators use. And I've heard them for the last couple of days. There are personal stories and there are case studies. Personal stories. Julian's story from yesterday, one of the most inspiring stories I've heard in years. Which story am I referring to? McDonald's, what happened? What happened to McDonald's? Did he work at McDonald's for a long period of time? No, he was fired from McDonald's. Why was he fired from McDonald's? Yeah, didn't have enough to eat. Of course, so he was eating the scraps at the end of the day. As a communication guy, I'm putting on my communication hat. And I want you to be your own communication coach, because I won't be with you in every presentation. Why? Why does he tell that story? What does that have to do with structuring premium financing for life insurance? It's because one story can transmit and transfer volumes of information about integrity, values. That's how we build rapport. The case studies you've heard all day, this morning and yesterday, those are case studies. Those are stories too. You may not see yourself as a storyteller, but when you give people an example, that's what you're doing. You're telling a story. Personal stories, though, are very powerful. My last book was called The Bezos Blueprint, which focused on some of the communication tactics that Jeff Bezos pioneered at Amazon. When he tells the Amazon story, he's a storyteller. He understands how to do this. Whenever Jeff Bezos is asked about the starting of Amazon, whether it's in presentations or interviews, do you think he starts in 1994 when Amazon first opened its doors? He doesn't. He always starts 30 years earlier, when he was born to a single mother in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He worked during the summers at his grandfather's cattle ranch, and there he learned values like grit, tenacity, and hard work. And he brings it up whether or not you ask him. Here's an excerpt from a podcast, the Lex Friedman podcast. I'm sure some of you listened to it.
Like, my grandfather had a huge influence on me, huge factor in my life. I did all the jobs you would do on a ranch. I've fixed windmills and laid fences and pipelines and, done all the things that any rancher would do. The great gift I got from it was that my grandfather was so resourceful. He did everything himself. He made his own veterinary tools. He would make needles to suture the cattle up with. Like, he would find a little piece of wire and heat it up and pound it thin and drill a hole in it and sharpen it. So, you learn different things on a ranch than you would learn, growing up in a city.
So self-reliance.
Yeah. Like, figuring out that you can solve problems with enough persistence and ingenuity.
He brings up those stories himself because one story tells you so much, transmits so much information about the speaker. Do you think the story is done? Far from it. There are a few more elements to the story. Now let's try to pick out why he uses these particular elements. Then I'm going to show you the structure of all great stories. After college, Jeff Bezos went to New York City where he worked for a hedge fund, and he came across a startling statistic. The internet was growing at 2,300%. He said, nothing grows that fast outside of a petri dish. I want in. Went back to Texas, borrowed a car, and headed out west to find his fame and fortune. You could already see, if this were a movie, the wagon wheels are starting to roll, heading out west. In a good story, is success a straight line? A good story, one that's engaging, is it always a straight line? Michael, you know this. It's never a straight line. We heard that yesterday from Julian. Richard Branson told me, if a story is one long success story, it's very boring. There's got to be hurdles. There's got to be challenges. And Amazon sure had those. Some of the challenges that Jeff Bezos likes to pick up on is that Amazon lost money, as you know, for 6 years, 6 or 7 years when it first started. Then the dot-com bust happened. And Jeff Bezos loves using this example when Barron's called it Amazon.bomb. He loves bringing this one up, loves reminding people about that. But what happened? How did it turn around? It turned around because Bezos told his team, if we remain obsessive about the customer and customer service, the rest is going to take care of itself. And it did turn around, and they reinvented everything from e-commerce to cloud computing to entertainment as well. What does that remind you of, by the way? Staying obsessively focused on the customer. Sounds like Julian's presentation yesterday. Always take care of the customer. You see what Bezos is doing? He's actually going over the hero's journey. How many of you have heard of the hero's journey? Okay, so not too many of you. I'll explain it briefly. The hero's journey is a storytelling concept introduced by a mythologist named Joseph Campbell in 1949. And he said that all stories from the beginning of time, from the tales of Gilgamesh to today, all follow a similar pattern. It's a structure. He didn't invent it, he just identified it. I have George Lucas in this graphic, because George Lucas has publicly admitted and credited the hero's journey for Star Wars. He said, if I had not learned the hero's journey, there's no Star Wars. It's just cool vehicles in space. There's got to be a structure to it. So that's the hero's journey, and it ends with stage 12, which is the return. The hero sets out on an adventure, struggles, but then finds the magic elixir. And that's what Campbell called it, the elixir. Here's the interesting part. This is more complicated. This would be for like a 2-hour screenplay. If you'd like to learn more about the hero's journey, if you really want to be a good storyteller, I've written a lot about it, and you can find other information. But I'm going to make it a little simpler for you. The point is, I want you to understand that this is how your clients see themselves in the world. I interviewed Ray Dalio, the billionaire hedge fund manager, when he wrote the book Principles. I'm sure many of you have read that very famous book, Principles. What inspired him to write that book? When he learned about the hero's journey. He said, the hero's journey gave me powerful insights about the heroes I know and the patterns of my own life. In fact, in one of the quotes from my article, he said, a hero is not a perfect person. All of you know that Ray Dalio had some big failures, very public failures in his life. He said a hero is not a perfect person, and he rarely gets things right, far from it. But a hero is someone who did something beyond the normal range of achievement and has given his life to something bigger than himself. And to return with that newfound wisdom, the elixir. That's the reward. This is the way people see their lives. So if you can fit your information into a hero's journey type of structure, that's really powerful. This is complicated. Let me give you something tangible that you can take home today. Overlaying the hero's journey is a much simpler structure that you can use for every great business presentation. Steve Jobs used this design. It's called the 3-act structure. You can use it for a presentation or an outline for your next meeting. Any of you have watched a good 2-hour movie? You recognize the 3-act structure. Act 1 is the setup. That is where the characters are introduced. Act 2 is the conflict. Act 3, the resolution. All good movies follow this setup, and so do good business presentations. In business, the setup would be the status quo. Here's the way your world or your life is like today. If you do not take action, however, and you remain in the status quo, we go to Act 2. Here's the potential problems that might arise if you stay in the status quo. And of course, the resolution is the elixir. In your case, could be premium financing or another type of policy that you put together. But it doesn't make sense to start from Act 3. You got to kind of start from Act 1. It doesn't have to be 30 minutes. It could be just 2 lines. Here's where you are today. Here's where your family is today. Don't take action. Here's the problem. Here's the resolution. I can completely see how this would apply to premium financing or a lot of the messages and policies that you put together. You can start by telling a family that, many families find that estate taxes erode wealth. Okay, that's just telling us what's happening in the world today. But because of that, they lose a significant portion of their estate. Bring in the elixir with premium financing. Now you can protect, grow, and preserve. That's the way we overcome objections. We can have a story for each one of these objections. Years ago, I interviewed Neil deGrasse Tyson, the famous science communicator, greatest science communicator on the planet. And I asked him, I said, Neil, how do you have just the right stories and the data points? Your interviews are so seamless. And he said, Carmine, it's deliberate. I know going in what the potential questions might be, what the potential objections might be, and I have stories in my back pocket. I pull them out to answer the question. I've got several stories, I've got several data points, and I've got several metaphors. I want to transition into metaphors, which is a part of storytelling. So first, think about a structure. You're a storyteller, you're not a presenter. A presentation complements your story, but go in with each meeting with a structure first. How do I want this arc, this journey, to look like? But now we have to embellish it with metaphor. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but if you remember back to your English class, what is a metaphor? Anybody remember what a metaphor is? Taking two different things, to show their similarities. That's a metaphor or an analogy. They're close cousins from what I've learned. Aristotle, goes back to Aristotle, nothing new. It's to be a master of metaphors, the greatest thing by far. When Michael Rothman yesterday said, help your clients open doors to what they're not seeing, that's a metaphor. I heard several other metaphors today. Good speakers think in terms of metaphor. Why? Because scientists have found the way we think, what we experience, what we do day to day is very much a matter of metaphor. When you're explaining something complex to one of your clients, you know what they're doing? You know what their brain is doing? Trying to find something familiar. How about if you hand it to them? We all know that famous writers always do this. That's what made Shakespeare Shakespeare. It is the east and Juliet is the sun, said Romeo. We all know Juliet is not the sun, but she has similar qualities. She's radiant. She lights up a room. In business, all great communicators in business use metaphors, much more than you think. How many of you have heard about stocks or investments that are surrounded by a moat? I hear this every day on CNBC. An analyst will always say, oh, we like this company. There's a moat around it. Does anyone know who came up with that metaphor? A moat? Our friend Warren Buffett. in one of his now famous shareholder letters about 20 years ago. He looks for investments like economic castles surrounded by moats. Read his shareholder letters. This 2025 has a ton of metaphors because he understands that he's not writing for people like him. He's writing for people who need help understanding complicated financial topics. Bezos, a master of metaphor. Why do you think he named Amazon Amazon? I named Amazon for the Earth's biggest river. Earth's biggest selection. Earth's biggest selection, Earth's biggest river, and it starts with A. We got ourselves a winner. But he didn't stop there. He created 2 pizza teams, smaller teams, to avoid bureaucracy. He looked at single-threaded leaders who would only take one project and be hyper-focused on the project. He hired missionaries over mercenaries. And how many of you have a flywheel at your organization? The flywheel. And you've heard of it, haven't you? Maybe you run a flywheel at your organization. That came from Jeff Bezos. He did not invent the flywheel. He didn't invent it. But this flywheel he credits for powering Amazon's growth. He didn't invent it, but he popularized it within Amazon. And where did he get it? He read it in a book, because people who know him told me he was a voracious reader. He read more material than anybody else on the team. Growth mindset. So you've got to be thinking about metaphor. When your clients are saying that they want to preserve like their family story or their dream, so the dream doesn't end, they're thinking in metaphor. You can have analogies. You could even say these type of things, or think of your own analogy, like Warren Buffett's approach to leverage in business, using other people's money wisely to generate outsized returns. Premium financing uses the bank's money to fund larger policies so you can keep capital invested elsewhere. This is my attempt. I get it, it's not perfect. That's not the point. I want you to start thinking of yourself as a storyteller. What metaphor or analogy am I going to use to make this understandable? People who are really good at metaphors are often the ones who are invited in the media. Take a look watch CNBC next time. You'll see the same faces because they're good communicators. This is Diane Swank, the chief economist at KPMG. I see her all the time. But look at the headlines from some of her interviews. Inflation is like a marathon. We haven't hit the hardest mile yet. Or I love this one. The Fed enters policy purgatory. I think this was from earlier this year. Yeah, in January. That's when the Fed couldn't decide because of all the things going on, what they were going to do. I called KPMG a couple of years ago, and I said, I've got to talk to Diane Swank. I haven't met her. I need to talk to her. I need to find out how deliberate this is. And we got on the phone, and she said, oh, the analogies and the metaphors I use, I do that all the time. Why? I look for any kind of hook that makes economics more understandable. Because if you cannot explain it, everything gets lost in translation. So I think of my job as a translator. That's your job, a translator. To conclude in the last few minutes of this morning's presentation, let me give you some very simple tactics to make the complex simple. And again, this is all part of storytelling. Yesterday, Deborah mentioned cognitive load. Very important. We need to make things simple. If you give people too many things to remember at any one time, they're not going to remember a thing. So two tactics in particular, I've used these with the CEOs and executives of some of the biggest brands in the world. They are proven and they work and they're based in cognitive science. My favorite, I learned this from John Medina. Always start with the big picture before details. John Medina said, this is how our brains evolved. When our cave-dwelling ancestors ran into a tiger, they did not ask, how many teeth does the tiger have? They asked, will it eat me? Should I run? Big picture before details. So when you give people a set of words, for example, this is a very famous example in the neuroscience literature. It's very simple. But when people are given a set of words, random words, and they are asked to memorize as many as they can, and then they are asked again maybe 2 hours or 2 weeks later, how do you think they go about memorizing? How would you go about memorizing these words? what would you start doing? What's that? Yeah, association. Let's start associating them. There's a lot of different tactics that people use. Here's the problem. I'm making you work for it. Don't make your clients work to understand the information. These 3-pound brains of ours, as John Medina said, consume a lot of energy. They don't want to work. Make it easy. It's called hierarchical structure. Whenever the groups that are given the same words in this structure, big picture, details, rain gear, beach gear, they always remember a lot more than the groups that were given random information. And that's nothing. Nothing compared. The complication of what you deliver is far, far greater than anything I just showed you. Those are easy and people can't remember 6 words. So when I was talking to a screenwriter in Hollywood one day, he said, "Oh, Carmine, the big picture, that sounds like what we call the log line." I said, "The log line? What's that?" Now this has become my favorite tactic. He said, "The log line. Whenever a screenwriter pitches a movie, they have to have a log line. The log line is the movie poster. In one sentence, what's the movie about? What do you think this movie's about? A police chief with a phobia for open water battles a gigantic shark with an appetite for swimmers and boat captains. What could that be? Jaws, of course. Log line. If you cannot get a studio executive interested in the movie, they're not going to read the script. How do you apply this to business? Let's go to Stanford University. 2 computer scientists, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. They had an idea for a search engine. So they went into the office of Michael Moritz, one of the big famous venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, and they said, "Google is our search engine, and it organizes the world's information and makes it accessible." Michael said, this is true, he said this to me, he said, "That was a really fascinating sentence. It piqued my interest." I said, "Do you guys have a demo? Come back on Monday." They pitched him on a Friday, they came back on Monday, by Tuesday they had an $11 million investment, and Michael Moritz did pretty well for himself. But here's what the lesson is. Michael Moritz told me this, I've never forgotten it. If an entrepreneur cannot express their idea in one sentence, I'm not interested, period. What's the one sentence that you want your client to take away from that meeting? I wrote a book on how to give a TED-style presentation. How do you give an 18-minute presentation? How do you take everything you know and condense it in 18 minutes? You don't. You don't take everything you know. You focus on one idea that you can articulate in a short sentence. Everything else supports the idea. But that one sentence is critical. And once you land on that sentence, repeat it at the beginning of your conversation and in your material. Premium financing, what is it? That's what people are going to be asking. It's a strategy that allows you to leverage other people's money to secure a larger life insurance benefit while preserving your cash flow. Again, not bad, but it's my attempt at that one sentence that I can understand. Yours might be different, and it might be different for every meeting. But make sure that you go in ready with what the movie's about. Then you can support it with details. I'm going to touch on one thing that Deborah started to talk about yesterday because it's so important and it works. How are we going to support it? We're going to support it with 3 things, not 28. Michael yesterday gave us 3 steps, not 29 steps. Why 3? Again, it's because this is the way we think. And it goes back to Aristotle. Everything goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle was the first to say a speech should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Gee, where have I heard that before? And that's why it's universal. In fairy tales, fables, books, things are broken up into 3 in any language. There's 3 little pigs, 3 musketeers. The genie grants Aladdin how many wishes? 3 wishes, not 32. 3. Even in the military, I was speaking to Jocko Willink. Some of you, I'm sure, listened to his famous podcast, former Navy SEAL. I brought up this whole idea of 3s.
I noticed that in your writing and in your speaking, you break things up into 3s. You typically have like 3 important leadership traits or 3 goals. Is that something that comes from leadership training?
There's a saying in the SEAL teams that the subordinates would sometimes tell the leadership, and that is, hey, boss, I can remember 3 things. You better make sure you know which 3 things you want me to remember. So we're going out on an operation. If you tell me 18 things, I'm not going to remember them. You can tell me 3 things. Those are the things I am going to remember.
What are the 3 things you want your client to remember at the end of the conversation? Deliberately create those 3 things and the log line before the conversation, before the meeting. 3, it's universal and it works. Avinash Kaushik is a very high-level data analyst at Google. I was speaking at Google once, and he was ahead of me, and here's what he told the sales staff. He said, if you have 1 hour with a potential customer or a prospect, talk about 3 opportunities with Google. If you have 1.5 hours, you could talk about 4. If you have 6 hours, you could talk about 4. He intuitively understood humans have a capacity for only 3 to 4 big ideas. So once you start with a movie poster, we're going to support it with 3 items. Maybe those 3 items are premium financing allows you to preserve liquidity, minimize taxes, and protect your legacy. Now let me give you details about each one. 1, 2, 3. Then at the end of the conversation, I'm going to show those three steps again. That's what people remember. And here's something that they found in the literature. When you give people a list, when you say, there's 3 things I want you to remember, they write it down. Their heads will go down. They want to write it down. And they'll look up and say, what was number 2? People love lists. They cannot resist lists. So to wrap this all up, I've given you some tactics and principles from years, hundreds and thousands of years of storytelling. I just want you to remember that the tools of communication have changed. The human brain is not. Don't get too caught up in the tools. Think about how you're going to structure the story first. You're the storyteller. You happen to know a lot about your business, but you're the storyteller. When you change the way you see yourself as a presenter, the presentation your audience sees will change. And that's when you will be ultimately more persuasive and more successful. Julian, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for listening. I'll be around during the break. Introduce yourself. I'd love to meet you. Thank you, everyone.